In SOC 2 Common Criteria 7.1, we get into the section that's called System Operations. And this particular criteria requires that you have a way to detect and monitor changes in system configurations and also susceptibility to newly discovered vulnerabilities. So let's talk about some examples about implementing that. First and foremost, firewall configurations. They're very critical to the protection of your system assets. It's something that lives at critical points within your network, whether it's on the perimeter or internally protecting systems that you have valued to the point of putting a firewall in front of them. You would want to make sure that nothing changed in that configuration without your knowledge and without understanding why that happened. And so having a mechanism in place to detect a change in the firewall, making sure that those changes are approved and carried out in a secure way. Unfortunately, we see a lot of times because there's some type of emergency and the config is wiped and restored and changes are made kind of on the fly, and there's not a follow-up to confirm the change against the firewall policy of what's allowed or disallowed. And people will just kind of move on and quickly edit a firewall config and don't go back to make sure that the change is properly documented and understood. And so that would be an example of a change that you would want to have a method of detecting or monitoring. The other thing really relates to your hardening standards. If you adopt a hardening standard that says we're going to harden our Amazon instance according to the best practices that they've published, or we're going to harden this Windows machine according to the Microsoft hardening standards, or we're going to use an independent hardening standard that's published by the Center for Internet Security, and we're going to implement that on all of our servers and our routers and our firewall and all these critical devices on our network. You would want to have a way to check that the configuration that you're expecting is still in place, and if anything does deviate from that standard, that you are aware of it. One way to do that would be through scans, vulnerability scans, to check against a certain benchmark in order to understand how your system compares against the published standard that you're striving to achieve. So, for example, having a policy that after any firewall configuration change, we're going to run this firewall analysis tool to verify that it's in compliance with our policy. Every time you deploy a new server or a new desktop, we're going to run this vulnerability scan to identify what ports and services are open and running. We're going to identify what software is installed, what user accounts are enabled, so that we can compare that against our hardening standard. And just on a regular routine basis, using vulnerability scans to accomplish that for the whole network so that you can identify what's running and are there any newly discovered vulnerabilities that we didn't previously know about that we should take action on this time. So those are some examples of ways that you would detect and monitor for these changes and for these new vulnerabilities. So think about how you would do that in your environment, and specifically think about what your standard is to begin with. What is your goal in how these things should be configured? How tight do you want it to be? Again, you should think in terms of a default deny policy. I want to start with nothing installed and only specifically allow the things that are necessary for the system to do what it is that we expect for it to do, and the software and the ports and the services that are necessary for our business.